Good morning, everyone. To our honorable guests, our distinguished NCBA customers, ladies and gentlemen, good morning once again. Welcome to the third NCBA Economic Forum of the year. My name is Rosalind Gishuru. I am the Group Director for Marketing, Communications and Citizenship, and I will be your host this morning. I'd like to thank you all for joining this call today. Our first economic forum held in February was a physical meeting at Radisson Blu, and it was themed Outlook 2020, where what we knew as normal has completely been redefined. The following one was held in April and was themed Navigating Financial Crisis in the Time of Corona, where we were just beginning to understand what COVID-19 was and how COVID was likely to impact our lives, businesses, and the economy. And even then, the only certainty was that our lives would be changed, but we were not exactly sure to what extent this change would happen. And now we're here in November, and we have all in one way or another dealt with COVID, whether personally or in our businesses. The effects have been harsh, and from the look of it, we don't know how long this pandemic will persist. But one thing is for sure, we need to all learn how to live with it. So this brings me to our theme today, which is macroeconomic reset amidst the COVID-19 pandemic and the uncertain road to recovery. And this morning, to help us navigate this conversation is a distinguished panel of guests. Mr. Nzioka Waita, Chief of Executive Staff, State House. Karibu sana, Mr. Nzioka. Mr. Mushai Kunyiha, Chairman of Kenya Association of Manufacturers. Welcome, Mr. Kunyiha. We will also have Kwame Owino, CEO, Institute of Economic Affairs. And to you, Kwame, I say welcome back. Mr. Hosea Mashuki, CEO, Fresh Produce Exporters Association of Kenya, a very warm welcome to you. And Mr. Dr. Mbui Wagasha, a renowned macroeconomist and policy expert. Karibu sana. And from within the bank, we have Mr. John Gashora, Group Managing Director, NCBA Group. Welcome, John. We have John Okulo, Group Director, Corporate Banking. Welcome, John Okulo. And we also have Raphael Agum, Director and Chief Economist at NCBA. Before I hand over to our first speaker, I would like you to request all of you to use the Q&A tab for questions, which will be addressed as we go along. And I also would ask you to please feel free and share your insights on social media using our hashtag NCBA Outlook 2020. So ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, it gives me great pleasure to invite our Group Managing Director, who will make his remarks and also allow our in-house Chief Economist, Raphael, to amplify his conversation further. Our Group MD will then invite our chief guest, Mr. Nzioka Waita, to also give his remarks. So over to you, John Gashora, and welcome.
Thank you, Rosary, and good morning, everyone. I want to first thank you for joining us this morning. And I also want to welcome especially our speakers today, led by our guest speaker, Nzioka Waita. I also do want to recognize our panelists again, Mr. Owino, Mr. Mashuki, Dr. Wagacha, and also my other good friend, Mr. Kunyiha. Welcome, and thank you for affording us the time. You would agree with me that a lot has changed since we last gathered under this platform 6 months ago. Our lives, businesses, and the economy have been upended in unimaginable ways. In April, when we last spoke on this platform, Kenya had just about 700 coronavirus cases with less than 20 fatalities. This study has since risen exponentially to about 56,000 confirmed cases with over 1,000 deaths. Our thoughts and prayers go out to those among us who have lost someone to this virus or have been affected in any way. Whereas the human toll in Kenya, and indeed Africa, has been comparatively lower than in advanced economies, the economic fallout from the virus has nonetheless been extraordinary. The global economy has been plunged into the worst recession in the post-war era, and the shocks from the pandemic could be longer lasting than initially thought. Estimates so far indicate that the virus could reduce global economic growth to a contraction of between 4.5% to 6% in 2020, before recovering partially to grow by between 2.5% and 5% in 2021. In fact, it is now estimated that global output will not go back to 2019 levels until late 2022 at the very earliest. For policymakers, all hands are on deck as they spare no tool to contain the economic fallout. The policy response has been unique in speed, size, and scope, eliciting an unprecedented concerted effort, combining monetary, fiscal, and prudential policies. The crisis has had several lessons for me as an individual and as a corporate leader. On the latter, I believe the need to be prepared to manage adversity and constantly build resilience cannot be overemphasized. Whereas things have begun looking up with the easing of restrictions, and I know the announcement from the president last night may negate part of that comment, you'll agree with me that it still feels like a truce more than an actual peace treaty. And it continues to call for a unique response and preparedness. Moreover, new opportunities and challenges continue to arise from the COVID economy. On a positive note, the pandemic has accelerated the shift towards automation across all sectors with positive efficiency gains. However, the shocks from the pandemic could also risk continued labor dislocations as a result of lingering high levels of unemployment and loss of useful skills from prolonged hours of work. The second wave headwinds are also now roaring closer on the horizon. Rising infection cases have resulted in a return of lockdowns in many countries and may significantly delay economic recovery. While even at its highest level, the secondary lockdowns may not be as strict as in March and April, the impact on consumers and business confidence cannot be gainsaid. The full impact of the pandemic will be dependent on the duration of the pandemic and require lockdowns, the voluntary social distancing that we will practice, which affects consumer spending, the long-term impact of firm closures and an unemployed workforce, reconfiguration in supply chains, and the extent of cross-border spillovers from weaker external demand, as well as funding shortfalls. This is unlikely to be immediately clear. Ultimately, the greatest lesson that COVID-19 can teach humanity is that we are in this together, and that life doesn't necessarily get easier or more forgiving. We can only strive to get stronger and more resilient. As the country grapples with the second wave of infections, it is clear that the operating environment could get murkier as the initial shocks are compounded by the resultant deterioration in consumer and business confidence. Our latest in-house economic forecast now project that Kenya's GDP could contract by about 1.8% this year, the weakest performance in nearly 4 decades. The loss in output reflects general lethargy in domestic and global demand, as well as a decline in both private and public investments. Growth is projected to recover to about 3.9% in 2021, although the pace of the recovery remains subject to 2 swing factors, one being the path of the pandemic, and the other the attendant scope of policy interventions. We acknowledge and applaud the impact that government interventions have had in cushioning households and businesses. the monetary, fiscal, and prudential response prevented the potential escalation of liquidity risks to solvency risks. While we acknowledge the challenging position that this has presented for the government, it is now obvious that policy support will be required for much longer than we had all initially thought. With those remarks, I'd like to welcome our Chief Economist, Rafael Agum, to shed a bit more light on our in-house views before I conclude my remarks. Welcome, Rafael.
Thank you very much, John, and good morning, everybody. Thank you, John, again for your leadership at this time of crisis. As has been noted by Rosalind and indeed yourself, really uncertain times for all of us. Thank you also our keynote speaker, Mr. Nzio Kawaita, Chief of Staff at the Executive Office of the President, and indeed our panelists, as has been noted. We are very privileged that you're able to spare time to come and join us. And to all our partners, thank you for your collaboration over the years. We thank you for your custom, and indeed we are very grateful that you've been journeying with us through this difficult year of 2020. I'll briefly try to provide further color to Mr. Gashora's preface, which I think is indeed summarized exactly what our thoughts are regarding the economic outlook, indeed how we close 2020, but also how we begin to see 2021 panning out from a macroeconomic standpoint. As Rosalind mentioned, we had the first initial conversation with yourselves just at the commencement of the crisis. Those who were able to join us must recall that I indeed drew our attention to our favorite Chicago economist of mine, Frank Knight, of course now departed, who gave us a very useful framework for discerning economic forecasting broadly, but more specifically how we differentiate between uncertain moments and what's that from quantifiable risk. Indeed, what I did put forward was our well-known fact that there's limits to our knowledge of future events, and especially with regard to trying to discern direction many days ahead. We have seen this, it's been 7 months into the crisis, and the situation remains as uncertain as we had outlined. As a matter of fact, I recall I alluded to, at a minimum, 4 events of this nature. The first, of course, was my reference to an asteroid, a potential asteroid hitting Mother Earth. And of course, we all know what that would mean. I did suggest that astronomy is still helping us keep that at bay, and so far there are no risks there. I also pointed to the possibility of a huge climate change catastrophic event. Of course, this is now topical, and the concerted efforts in our own, as NCBA, you did see GMD launch our tree nursery project, which of course addresses some of the concerns around the environment broadly, showing you just how attentive we are to the evolving climate generally. And then I also pointed out to what we all wish never happens, which is a nuclear confrontation with all the catastrophic consequences that may bear for us. And then the last, of course, which was just commencing at the time, was the emergence of a virulent virus or a pandemic, as we now call it, and that indeed is what is ensuing as we speak. So what that has done is 7 months out, we now are living through the COVID economy. So if you look at my first slide, the COVID economy is playing out in earnest. And indeed, for every macroeconomic forecaster, this is the singular lens for which we have to at least get clarity with regard to how macroeconomic variables pan out, whether you're looking at GDP output numbers, or you're looking at inflation numbers, or indeed unemployment being the 3 key ones. So as noted by our group managing director already, the path of the pandemic remains highly fluid and uncertain. As we speak, cases are still rising. I think if you look globally, the US recorded historical numbers just last night. In actual fact, if you look at the WHO numbers, we are now just slightly below 48 million in terms of number of infections, with unfortunately just over 1.2 million deaths. In our own country, well, this number is still big because one number is one too many, but we have almost 1,027 deaths as of yesterday and 56,000 confirmed cases. Now, in terms of discerning the future direction of economic growth, or the three key variables I've outlined, it obviously means that one has to take a view of how the epi curve, or what they call the epidemiological curve, plays out. It would give you, from a trendline basis, what sort of scenario you expect from the public health angle, including the responses thereto. And in trying to discern the direction of economic activity, given the fact that this is so at approximate level, so wedded onto the path of the pandemic, we looked at three scenarios, the first of which, of course, being the baseline. Baseline in traditional forecasting terms basically means what we know now, and we project that there is no change within the current framework of the given knowledge. So if you will, it's what we understand as human beings at the moment. That scenario, of course, presumes that, or rather illustrates that we do not see a vaccine anytime until for the remainder of 2020, and perhaps broadly so into 2021. Reality is that there's significant movement in terms of the landscape of COVID-19 candidate vaccines. If you look at that sort of data from the World Health Organization, there's almost 100 candidates, or vaccine candidates currently ongoing, some at human trial phase. So yes, there is hope there. And we had hoped, actually, given the November 4th US election, that it was supposed to be the so-called October surprise, that the US would surprise us with a vaccine. But we all know now that that has not tarried. And in actual fact, the election itself has presented a new mix into the economic trajectory, as it were, and we probably have chance with our panelists to unpack that a little bit. So no vaccine is anticipated for a big part of 2020. And even if we do get a vaccine, given the developments we are seeing, yes, I know Moderna and the Oxford one is at really, really decent stages with good results. But the reality is that we don't get a vaccine anytime near this half of, rather the first half of 2021. And if at all, whether it will be widely and equitably distributed is another issue. That also is a concern at the health policy level. But that scenario, of course, will then mean that the current pace and structure of social distancing measures, which indeed will ordain economic activity for the most part, remains uninterrupted. Indeed, the OECD projects that under that scenario, you see global income losses to the tune of almost $7 trillion, and some of it is already panning out. And then, of course, as the GMD has already alluded to in its preface or opening remarks, that gives us a contraction, at least in the Kenyan case, of just 1.8%. There is, of course, need for us to maintain a clarity with regard to what could be the best case. That scenario, of course, which everybody is praying for, is the finding of a vaccine and ready and available, equitably distributed across the board, across all the 219 affected countries globally. And then, of course, that means that you can have meaningful unfreeze of economic activity, and then drives potential to the extent that we all wish to see in future. Worst case scenario is an untidy one. We, of course, don't see a vaccine discovered in that scenario. Governments continue exporting even more drastic mobility restrictions. Indeed, the fear yesterday for most of the country as the president was coming to address us was actually that given the recent experience, particularly in the last 2 weeks, that perhaps the worst case scenario was panning out with regard to the containment measures that would be necessary. And so everybody, I'm sure, was waiting very, very keenly to see developments there. Luckily for us, we've seen more careful and more structured restrictions coming out of the executive, and that's a good news. At least from the way we see it. Now, the reality is that at a global level, therefore, if you have that sort of uncertain path, on my left, I just try to chart out for you how we see the folly or the fluidity around economic forecast broadly. Indeed, I was joking this morning, just as we're still waiting for the results out of the US, statistical science or indeed forecasting or prediction analysis is taking a significant hit. So I come to this conversation of presenting our forecast with a lot of humility. The polls, at least in the US electoral dynamic in 2016, got it wrong. It would seem that even though slightly improved this time around, it just shows you how uncertain sometimes in price of science statistics can be. So in terms of GDP forecasting as well, nothing is any different. We are seeing a very fluid forecasting environment with almost every economic house coming up with revisions from month to month. And indeed, we have revised our forecast, including our assumptions, because you update your models as you get new information. Now, with that sort of perilous and fluid, uncertain path, what we see from at least the IMF is that GDP growth across the board for 2020 is lost. So every forecast is giving us, at least at the global level, as our GMD already alluded to, a contraction of just about 4.4%, sometimes even higher. And then, of course, in Sub-Saharan Africa, we are seeing a contraction of minus 3.3. In our Kenyan case, as the GMD alluded to, of course, we are contracting at 1.8. That's on a baseline scenario basis. There is good news that in terms of partial recovery, both from just pent-up demand and return of economic activity, including reopening measures that we've seen across the board at a global level, that return is projected to give us some recovery again across the board, and at a global level, it's presumed or forecasted to come out at about 5.2. In the Sub-Saharan Africa case, we're only seeing about 3.1 or thereabout. In the Kenyan case, as already been pointed out, about 3.9. Now, the point to note, though, is that sort of outcome at the global level provides indeed the field, if you will, of the framework within which counter-cyclical policy interventions have played out. So what I mean is, in order to address the shock, the macroeconomic shock arising out of the pandemic, of course, you pursue counter-cyclical policy interventions. It would be it on the monetary policy side or fiscal side. In terms of fiscal response, it's unprecedented. Indeed, by what IMF numbers, almost 11.2 trillion worth of new money has gone into addressing the crisis and responding to the shock. Of course, the result of that is at a global level, we are ending up with a situation where fiscal deficits are rising. And in our case, I guess this is topical. If you read our business news, also there's deep conversation always around debt sustainability numbers, analysis, and projections going forward, especially if you infer the implications of this pandemic on revenue performance at that level. So at the global level, nobody is left behind. Indeed, even emerging and developed economies, we see that level of bulging fiscal deficits. And as a matter of fact, it's the scope and access of capital markets is consequential in terms of how we see emerging markets specifically and frontier markets responding to the kind of deficit scenarios that is unfolding. So with that weakened fiscal space, of course, counter-cyclically, apart from just massive expansion in public expenditure targeting health, what you've had on the monetary policy side is globally, central banks have opted for a reduction in benchmark rates across the board. We have seen led by the Fed, move towards the zero bound, so zero interested policy environment in the manner in which we saw in 2008. And this is especially intriguing and interesting because we now have almost confirmed case where everybody is going for lower benchmark rates for longer. In the Fed case, we have been promised the zero interest policy almost till sometime in 2023. Now, that weakened fiscal space, of course, leaves monetary policy as the key sort of response mechanism. Indeed, the reality is all the monetary policy responses have been useful insofar as at least stabilizing the financial side. So if you look at from a financial distress point of view, there's massive liquidity support targeting businesses in the first instance, but also payroll support in some instances. And then what that has made sure is that at least from a stability standpoint, despite the risks of the so-called liquidity trap that poses for a global macroeconomic policy, reality is that that stability has been ensured despite the unfortunate evolution of the crisis itself. Now, of course, if you listen to my commentary, it points to one key uncertainty. So at the global level, uncertainty still remains, both at the epidemiological level, as I said, if you look at the epi curve, and especially second round movements across Europe and also in the US, and in our case, also just sustained number of cases. So that uncertainty has bred into, as already feeds into what we call a volatility. The key indicator there that we look at from a financial market standpoint remains the Chicago Board of Trade, the volatility index, which we call the VIX. If you can see in October, it's almost sparked as high as we've seen in recent memory. So COVID developments and indeed news around vaccine development broadly continue to drive some of that conversation. Be that as it may, asset class performance at a global level, including equities, frankly remain decent for the most part. And I think the key implication, because the dollar is a reserve currency, what we've seen is the sort of traditional reserve play into and out of the dollar, driving that mix. And with a sustained and almost confirmed yield outlook of flat for longer, we then see that sort of scenario unfold. Be that as it may, in the last quarter particularly, and we now have a good sight of Q3 sort of dynamics from a leading indicator point of view, we are seeing increased optimism, even though the risks and the uncertainty that I was underscoring remain. And the question, of course, remains, what will be the extent of the reopened sectors of the economy? Of course, if you have traditionally services will remain within the current broad structures of social distancing measures. So that cannot, in every estimation, return at full bearing, but on the manufacturing side of broader production, and indeed, Mr. Kunyiga will shed some light on this shortly, you can see a little bit of some return there, but broadly speaking, services will remain within that constraint of the new structure, including how business models will inform the nature of work and determine what size of the economy you have in return. But the point to note there is some green shoots, there is some rise in optimism, especially in the last month or so. Now, in a nutshell, because our focus remains on the Kenyan case, that's a global picture in which Kenya finds itself into. And we are indeed very pleased to have Mr. Nzioka with us today to sort of give us some in-house, or rather some executive thoughts about how the macro outlook for Kenya will pan out. In our case, what we've looked at, as I've already alluded to in terms of our modeling scenario, it gives us all growth projections. The reality is, just like in the global context, the COVID-19 pandemic, or coronavirus disease as they call it, will continue to have that sort of broad-based shock to output. What we have seen is now we have Q2 numbers from KNBS, and the interesting scenario is that Q2, not interesting, let me choose my words carefully. I mean, the unfortunate scenario is that Q2 although we now are convinced remains a plateau, remains really the bottom, was worse than we anticipated when we last spoke with you. And reality is that there's been a complete significant contraction in output across accommodation and food services, education, taxes on products, and indeed transport and storage. The numbers are mind-boggling. If you looked at the reports that the KNBS released, the economy contracted by about 5.7% in Q2. If you compare year on year, 2019, we grew by 5.3 in a similar period. Now, of course, that all is coming from the reality that meaningful economic activity is not returning full wards and all, because we have to maintain the current posture in addressing the pandemic, which means that you actually freeze economic activity for much longer than we have seen. There are green shoots in those numbers though, and including Q3 leading indicators I've seen, there are significant positives from that as well. And for instance, we saw a very steady performance in agriculture. Keep in mind that in Q1, agriculture gave us a surprise steady bedrock of about 4.9. What has happened in Q2, it turned out at 6.4, particularly about 35% performance in tea exports. And I think Mr. Hosea will also allude to some of that in his remarks. So in a nutshell, even though we contract in 2020, projection is that on a both best case scenario, that is assuming the kind of epidemiological curve I described, we see 2021 with potential recovery to about 3.9, as we've alluded to earlier. And then depending on how much of the economy comes back, indeed, there's very interesting and robust debate about the size of economic return, whether you're having an 80% return or 70% return in terms of economic activity. We'll leave that to some of the debate in the panel, but the reality is pre-COVID numbers will be a while before we get back there. And the output may not reach 2019 levels, perhaps much further out into 2021 in terms of just what has been lost. So the worst case is, and I don't want to spend so much time on that, but the worst case scenario is what we are seeing, a determination from a policy response point of view, cleverly walking away from, which is, more drastic closures. And I think nobody has appetite for this, both at the policy level, but also just from a consumer sentiment or indeed animal spirits, as they call it in traditional economics, remaining very stubbornly determined to get on with their lives. So that seems to me like is moving out further out. So the uncertainty will sustain fragility. Consumer spending, of course, including business investment, will be largely impaired by that uncertain outlook. The fiscal response, even in our own domestic case, and Dr. Wagasha will have time to at least demonstrate this, there's absolutely very little fiscal space in terms of policy responses. And it doesn't help that on the labor side, the labor markets are indeed completely fragile. We've seen a doubling in the quarterly employment numbers to about 10.4. And because there's a 2-month lag, we can only imagine how much of that number may deteriorate. So in terms of our domestic response, you remember we had the 8-point economic stimulus program within this year's budget. I think it has sustained it has forestalled a worse sort of performance than we'd anticipated, to the extent that it could. There was a raft of developments there in terms from the sovereign, in terms of just seeking rapid credit facilities, including bilateral support. And so the evolution of our public debt, even though, yes, noted as a policy concern, reality is the expenditure thereto and that public outlay was necessary in order to stem, at least to save lives, if not livelihoods. The government has promised a rethink of our development strategy broadly in view of the new developments coming out of COVID. So whereas the Big Four agenda will drive in the short to medium term So, and that, if you recall, remains expenditure outlays into universal health coverage, food security, affordable housing, and manufacturing in the manner that has been outlined innumerable times before. The Cabinet Secretary for Treasury has promised that indeed the government is working on an economic strategy, especially as we head towards the closure of Vision 2030, and that will give some color in terms of taking in view some of the developments from that. But what we see, of course, from a sectoral performance point of view, and we have sectoral players. We have somebody from agriculture, Mr. Hosea, will give us some snapshots in terms of agricultural performance and outlook. And then on the manufacturing side, Mr. Kunyia will sort of give us their thoughts on how the pandemic has played out and how they see manufacturing recovery. Be that as it may, I think given the over 30% component of agricultural support that we get from overall GDP size, I think it's fair to say that with good agricultural performance, perhaps we would have seen worse if it weren't for the kind of numbers that we've seen from there. So the lower fiscal space, I need to hand back to our GMD to carry on with the conversation. So in the interest of time, I've already noted that the concern remains that fiscal space, meaning that monetary policy will still be quite instrumental in stabilizing the future path of this economic recovery as we see it. And in that scenario, yes, we note that there are issues around the lower zero bound, but there's still some space with regard to, from a central bank reference rate, moving in the manner in which you outlined. So perhaps there could be some use for monetary policy stimulus should it be necessary. But of course, if you look at inflation numbers and broader macro outcomes, for now, the current policy stance is widely accommodative and is supportive of all the policy priorities as has been enunciated by the government. So in terms of addressing the policy context, and I'd like to pick Dr. Agasha's thoughts on this, of course, the priority will remain on the fiscal consolidation path that was embarked on. We had assurance from the Cabinet Secretary that indeed still remains a policy priority. Of course, it has been exacerbated by the kind of public investment outlay that we've seen in response to the pandemic, but that will remain a key policy focus. We think, therefore, that stability broadly will be granted. And just to close finally, because this is a key important prize, the currency scenario is, we note that there's been significant pressure on it because of obvious reasons, new dynamics regarding our external balances, but on a trend level, on a headline level, it's important to note that the current account performance remains fairly steady and improving. So as a minus 5.4% as we projected out, and likely to remain so, particularly if you take in view the performance out of tea and the broader agro space. I guess we'll see on the fresh produce side as well whether there is any notable input from there. And then, of course, the one that slate as it remains, as for our remittances, we had thought when we last spoke to you that there could be some disruptions there given just the labor deterioration out of North America, which is a key source market for our remittances. Reality is remittances remain quite strong and steady, at least to date. So in terms of delivering the macroeconomic objectives as outlined, yes, we have forecasted that sort of contraction in 2020. Indeed, this contraction across the board. Notable sectors remain the services side, because you had to contain people, if I'll use that adjective, and keep them away from work in order to save their lives, or rather to deal with the massive spread of this virus. And then, of course, you have a slowly return of manufacturing, and you have agriculture supporting that. What then we are seeing in a nutshell is there will be some sort of macroeconomic reset, hence our theme today, which is that taking the key lessons from the COVID-19, indeed, as Mr. Gashora alluded to in his brief welcome remarks, there will be some sort of business model implications for everyone across the board, and that is going to inform the broader macroeconomic strategies that the country will pursue. And we think that the numbers will turn out the way they are. So with that, I'd like to hand over back to our GMD, Mr. John Gashora, to continue with his remarks and carry on with the program. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Rafa, for for shedding quite a bit of light on some of my comments earlier, and I hope that has been useful to everybody. I think what is clear is that the path of the pandemic remains quite uncertain. And whereas progress towards a vaccine has been encouraging, we all know that the possibility of it being globally available remains elusive. Then given this reality, we have to continuously find ways to live with the pandemic as a neat and determinant end still remains elusive. This is a challenging time for many of us, but I'd like to assure you that we are in this together and we'll continue to search for ways to inspire each of our dreams to go for it. This platform is indeed one way for us to continue the dialogue on all the probable paths and terrains of the ensuing macroeconomic reset amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Hopefully, we will jointly find ways to make it a little less painful for every one of us. And indeed, for that reason, this morning, we are very honored to be joined by, as we said before, a very wonderful group of panelists, as well as our main speaker, who I shall now go ahead to introduce. Mr. Nzioka Waita is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya of over 18 years standing. He was part of Safaricom between 2001 and 2015, where he steadily rose through the ranks to serve the company in various capacities. In April 2015, President Uhuru Kenyatta appointed Mr. Waita as the Secretary of Delivery in the Executive Office of the President. In that position, he was tasked to create a strong development delivery office that would give the President line of sight to his administration's key development projects and programs. Bearing that success, in March 2016, Mr. Waita was appointed to the role of Deputy Chief of Staff and Deputy Head of the Public Service. In this capacity, he was in charge, again, of the President Delivery Unit, the Office of Budget Management, Performance Contracting, and Oversight Office of the State Corporations Office. He was later promoted to Chief of Staff of the Executive Office of the President, which is his current role. I am sure that places him in a very good position to share with us his views, as well as give us some insight into the policy interventions that Raphael talked about that we need to weather this crisis. Mr. Nzioka Waita, welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. And good morning to everybody, the panelists who we introduced ourselves earlier, and of course to all your esteemed guests who are watching us this morning. Just a quick qualifier that I'm not going to talk economics. My job is to execute. I am what they call the tip of the spear. Ours is not to conceptualize. We assume that the economists have done their work and their projections. So I'm really going to talk about what happens now going forward with COVID being a reality and the economy being what it is and going in the direction that has been forecasted. So I'll try and be very brief in terms of the PowerPoint to allow more room for a really robust discourse. Next slide, please. I've taken the liberty to share a link which sort of unpacks the Big Four agenda in great detail. And so I'll not go into that now. I think anybody on this can take the time to view that video and really get the detailed metrics that we use to project what we figured was a picture of success at the end of medium term 3 as regards the Big Four. So please take some time, click onto that link and watch it. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, the macro, the macro environment, Raphael has talked to that quite a bit, but bottom line is we've come out of an interesting period where we had a lull between 2017, 2018. We peaked in 2019, growing up to 5.4% GDP. And then now with COVID, we've taken quite a substantive hit in the budget statement for 2021-2022, the National Treasury is forecasting that the economy will contract to about 2.6%. And that's really sort of bearish view, but it's becoming a stark reality for us at the moment, because the pandemic is showing no signs of receding. In fact, it seems to be becoming more voracious in terms of its impact. There is, however, every anticipation that we will bounce back in the next year. That anticipation must be somewhat muted based on some of the realities around the availability of a vaccine. And I'll talk to that a little bit later. Next slide, please. The macro has remained fairly stable coming into 2020. And without going into too much detail, I think all these numbers have been talked to by Raphael, and it's publicly available data. But bottom line is, we were starting from a good place, and we are now in a much more difficult place now with COVID. And the question in everybody's mind is what happens to government agenda and what happens to the big four. And I'd want to talk to that in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So COVID has come with its set of winners and losers. Top of the winning list, of course, is ICT, is technology. It's what we are doing right now. Who would have thought 1 year ago we would embrace this technology so wholeheartedly across the board? You know, some of the what we in technology call layer 8 problems have been overcome. I have my mother, old people who are now who have become digital natives, so to speak. So it's really an upside for us in so many ways, because Kenya has been a front runner in terms of leapfrogging where technology is concerned, and this has been no different. The kind of movement onto ICT platforms has been quite seamless and across the board, and definitely something that has supported our survival in this scenario. The healthcare industry, it goes without saying, has seen huge upsides, both in terms of just people taking very good care of themselves, increased sales in pharma products, and of course, through the unfortunate hospitalization of quite thousands of people on account of COVID, that has also lifted the healthcare industry somewhat. Food and essential goods has provided a very strong base. You will note that even during the most extreme lockdowns, the first lockdown we had in April, going through all the way into August, food continued to move. It's one thing that we ensured continued to flow from farm to marketplaces, the retail distribution chains. There was no breakdown in the supply chain of food. And I think that for us is testament to how strong our agriculture sector is, and how much room there is for improvement, particularly during this period. In terms of the big losers, I mean, it goes without saying that travel across the board, whether it's matatus, airlines, international travel, domestic travel, has taken a huge hit. Hospitality and tourism is really a tragic story. Right now, our big hotel chains, our very vibrant tourism sector, which is such a key cog in our economy, both in terms of its contribution to Forex and its contribution to employment. This for us is a red flag, and it's something we're paying close attention to. And even when you look at the stimulus interventions, a lot of them have been targeted to sort of keep this hospitality sector moving. Not necessarily thriving, but just to keep people in their jobs, even those who have had to take severe pay cuts, at least try to give them some form of job security during this very difficult time. The upside though, and just to talk a little bit more about what has happened in the health sector, is that since March, You now have an additional 407 doctors in the public service. You have over 1,000 nurses recruited in the last 8 months. You have 8,000 new clinicians working behind the scenes in public hospitals. We have 3,797 medical interns, and all this data is at as of the beginning of October 2020. The missing link in healthcare, which has always been at the primary healthcare level, community health workers. We now have 27,000 new health workers in our healthcare system. These are big changes, and it makes a huge difference for the quality of healthcare at the grassroots levels. In terms of the response to COVID, and this is primarily at grassroots level, this is across the 47 counties, from 80 isolation facilities in March to 290 in October. From 1,893 isolation beds for diseases such as COVID to 7,400 beds, permanent beds, might I add, in October. From no isolation facilities to 46 isolation facilities. This for us has been a dry run for, God forbid, for future pandemics. And the playbook is now pretty well defined. And I think the country now is well schooled on how to respond to pandemics of this nature. In terms of isolation beds, from having no isolation beds in March to having 4,015 at present. And these numbers continue to rise with the current focus on strengthening healthcare systems at devolved levels. In terms of the road to recovery remains fairly uncertain. But we do have to plan, and we must plan based on our realities. Many of you have seen how the budget priorities were changed in the course of the financial year, and the need for us to repurpose some of the funds towards an economic stimulus package. Some of the key elements of this economic stimulus package, including major changes to taxation, corporation tax, individual pay-as-you-earn tax, turnover tax, changes to the application of import duties and levies, changes towards acceleration of VAT refunds and other such things which are critical for the economy to keep moving, interventions into the hospitality sector, direct cash interventions to the most vulnerable members of our society, cash direct interventions for big majority of our jobless youth in terms of the National Hygiene Program, or what we call Kazi Mashinani, Kazi Mtaani. And these are all interventions that have come at great cost to the government, and of course, forced a rethink of some of the key priorities in terms of execution. The post-COVID economic recovery strategy, and I hate using the term post-COVID because we don't necessarily have an end date to COVID. So this is really some of the works in progress. And a lot of this thinking is being done in conjunction with the private sector. So key stakeholders from the manufacturing sector, from the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, from other non-state actors, civil society. A lot of what needs to happen next is more of a discourse. The government does not maintain the monopoly of knowledge on this, and some of these interventions are largely fed from inputs from the private sector. So implementation of the economic stimulus program, ensuring that these interventions reach the people that they are targeted to reach, enhancing the role of the private sector in funding development. So you will see a very deliberate shift in PPP and strengthening the PPP unit, which has previously been underproductive in the National Treasury, but now there's great emphasis in terms of leveraging off-balance sheet solutions for national development agenda. And this will work greatly to the benefit of the private sector and create opportunities for particularly the financial services sector. Development of local production and value chains, really trying to stimulate both demand and supply, and I'll talk to this a bit later. looking at targeting recovery of the SME layer, and for now putting a really tangible credit guarantee scheme in place. You know, before we've been talking about the Biashara Fund, but I think for the first time now, we have a very well-rounded, well-consulted, and well-structured credit guarantee scheme that is underwritten by the government, but will be facilitated in large part by the private sector. This credit guarantee scheme is now funded to the tune of 3.5 billion, with additional funds being sourced. The government is really looking to be the guarantor of last resort, and to provide a backstop to commercial banks to lend to the specific value chains within the SME space. And this we hope will serve in this particular time to keep the SMEs afloat, but also to support SMEs in those value chains that are critical drivers of the economy. The digitization of government functions, I'll talk to a bit later. Social protection for us remains a key area of focus. Kenya has many interesting factors. One is because of our geography in the Horn of Africa, climate change is hitting us perhaps a lot harder than most parts of the world. Because of our position in the Horn of Africa, we are also hit by the situation of the locusts. We should probably be bracing ourselves for around 2 of locust invasions coming out of Yemen and Djibouti and Eritrea, and coming across our way because of the monsoon winds, the Kaskazi winds, and those we expect to hit us probably in the course of the next 6 months or so. This creates big exposure for those most vulnerable in our society, and the need for strengthening and maintaining our social safety nets for the elderly, for women, for children remains a priority of the government. Next slide, please. So what happens next? I mean, you must be asking yourselves, in terms of the Big Four agenda, what happens next in terms of execution? What do we do that doesn't require huge resources, and what can we do with the resources we have and with the reality that we have today? It's no secret that revenue collections are down, and this is really a straight extrapolation from the reduction, I mean, the contraction of the economy. But we must be able to focus on those deliverables that are not necessarily cash hungry, and rework our resource envelope accordingly. So on the housing side, in terms of the key drivers, first of all, bringing into operation KMRC. Kenya Mortgage Refinance Corporation is already funded. Shareholding is subscription is complete. The intention here is to on-lend to commercial banks to give mortgages at single-digit numbers. So whereas this may not necessarily lead immediately to increase in housing, it will lead to uptake of already existing affordable housing by those who can now access low-cost mortgages at sub 10%, of course, underwritten by the Kenya Mortgage Refinance Corporation. The government has also focused a lot on reclaiming government-owned land, which has been grabbed. And this purpose for this is really to put it back into our land banking, because with land banking, we will have better control of policies around availability of land. Land has become a big factor in the cost of housing, and more so because our speculative practices have driven the cost of land beyond its economic value, and that's something that the government needs to correct, but this can only be done through a mix of policy and also just making what is a very finite resource available to those who are prepared to do housing projects and developments within a master planned environment that works for the population most in need. Legislative reforms on sectional properties, we believe, will also be a big factor in unlocking the housing sector. For banks, I'm sure, and many people know that you do not get individual title deeds to sectional properties like apartments. This has multiple implications in terms of unlocking value from those assets, securitizing those assets to unlock value and to spur development for municipalities, county governments, and it becomes a source of revenue, because when sectional properties are well defined, it then allows for targeted and specific rates and rents to be collected. This will have a huge multiplier effect, particularly in urban areas. Digitization of the titling process, so digitizing of land registries across the board, and removing human interaction as far as possible in this process, bringing transparency into the land process, cleaning up fraudulent title documents, and just providing some level of transparency that will allow people to transact in land quickly and efficiently, and without the need for interlocutors who create toll stations for corruption. The government is currently in the last phase of completing a geospatial mapping. This geospatial mapping is a full GIS data for the entire country. The last update of this was done in 1972 by the government then, with the assistance of the British government. This is now being done wholly in-house by the government of Kenya, and this work will be complete by June in 2021. This data will provide granular real-time information, 17 layers of data on land, right down from how land use is done, overlaid with resources like water, forests, being able to understand road infrastructure that is in works, that is helping county governments with urban planning, being able to delineate sectional properties for purposes of planning, disaster response rates, and rent collections and revenue realization across the board. So these are huge steps that we believe don't require much resources, but are very essential in progressing the Big Four agenda. When we come to food security, operationalization of the Kenya Commodities Exchange will be a huge difference for us in terms of bringing transparency into the trade of food. We want, as part of the restructuring of our cereals board and strategic grain reserve, to really diversify the food basket, to remove the government role in setting the prices for things like maize, and allowing farmers through warehouse receipting to realize value from their produce really as quickly as possible. If we give farmers early access to markets, allow them to liquidate their crop, allow them access to resources at the quickest possible way, and the most transparent being the warehouse receipting program and the COMEX. This, we feel, will have a big impact in terms of improving productivity and getting people back into farming. Farming has lost some of its luster, really because of the overheads, market access issues, input quality, data for soil quality, fertilizers, and things of that nature that have really mitigated the growth of what should be the bedrock of our economy. Key sector reforms in sugar, dairy, coffee, and tea are underway. These are difficult, political, have a lot of tension, but they need to be done. You know, we need the sugar belt to make financial sense. We need to retire non-performing assets within the public sector as far as sugar value addition is concerned. On the dairy side, we need the most value to go to the farmers. We need to lower the cost of inputs for dairy farmers. But most critically, we need to bring some form of predictability and stability to the market price for milk and value addition to those products. Coffee and tea, tea has been fairly stable, but this disconnect has largely been the delta between what the tea sells for on the international markets and what trickles down to the tea farming community. That in itself is unbundling and trying to reconstruct decades of practice and tradition that has not necessarily benefited those who are at the point of inflection in the farms. Coffee has been a shrinking export for us, but Kenya has a premium product. We are trying as far as possible to help this sector get back on its feet, not just in terms of volumes, but also in terms of quality of our coffee and maintaining our status as a premium coffee provider in the world. I've talked about the restructuring of the Cereals and Produce Board. We have gutted this organization and repurposed it completely from being a store of maize where maize can be stored for years and getting rotten to simply being having resources to provide strategic grain and food for the country. This includes diversifying what we consider a strategic food reserve. So previously, we have only considered maize primarily a strategic food reserve. We are diversifying this to include other grains like rice. We have a huge production of rice in a number of counties. We are looking at other grains like dengu and cereals like dengu and others, just to make sure that once we diversify this strategic food reserve, number one, we can support farming communities better, but also we can minimize our dependency on last-minute imports of maize from either from within the region or from South America or South Africa. Livestock sector reforms are also well underway. These are not cost heavy on the government, but they are very critical. And I'll give you a case in point. The Bachuma livestock quarantine facility, which is almost at completion, will completely reorient our export opportunities. Kenya is a potential supplier to the entire GCC community, particularly during the periods of the Hajj, during Eid, and other periods where GCC countries can consume over 10 million pieces of sheep and goat. Now, they've still been consuming sheep and goat from Kenya, but these sheep and goat have been smuggled out of the country through Somalia, through Djibouti, and exported as product of Djibouti into the GCC countries. Reforming our quarantine facilities, meeting the phytosanitary standards that are required within the GCC countries allows us an opportunity to first of all, ensure that our farmers, our pastoralists get value for export products and that value is retained within Kenya for the benefit of our economy. We continue to work on expanding international market access. We have done significant deals with the People's Republic of China to allow fresh produce in, some of it initially going in as frozen fresh produce, currently under renegotiation to go in as fresh produce, things like avocado, huge markets, and discussions ongoing with the United Kingdom on the post-Brexit FTA, which was concluded just 2 days ago, and ongoing discussions with the United States on the US-Kenya FTA, again, opening up markets for our farming produce. On universal health coverage, again, looking at what we can execute without breaking the bank and based on our current realities. We are currently in the last phases of the policy documentation for a very strict price control mechanism for essential drugs. A huge component of the cost of medical care for the bulk of our citizens is the cost of medication. In Kenya, it is not unfamiliar to find drugs which are sold both in the private and public circles with markups in excess of 300 to 400%. Drugs that are necessary for cardiovascular health, for managing diabetes, for managing other common diseases, and more recently for managing cancer and other similar diseases. All these costs add up and really have a huge impact on our citizens, and focusing on what meets the price control list is what we are doing. This is not something out of kilter with us being a free market economy, because it has been implemented with ruthless efficiency within the European Union, within the United Kingdom, and other jurisdictions that have taken a decision to price control essential drugs for the benefit of their citizens. Improved flow of funds is another issue for us. Primary healthcare facilities are the point of inflection for most Kenyans. So, we are trying to create a scenario where we have recruited enough health workers at dispensaries and level 1 facilities to deal with healthcare issues at the grassroots, preventing flow into level 3 and level 4 facilities, which are primarily referral facilities, and dealing with primary healthcare issues at source. This requires proper flow of funds from the national government to the county government, and also in terms of revenues generated from public health facilities at level 1, level 2, to ensure that revenue generated by counties from health services are not put into, are not fungible, and they're not put into accounts for the counties that are utilized for other services other than health. So we are trying to ring-fence health funds at national government level to ensure that we meet the global commitment of at least 10% of budget towards healthcare, but at county level to guarantee that funds targeted for health remain within the health services. The reform of the National Hospital Insurance Fund has been painful, but thankfully we are now at the tail end of that exercise. The National Hospital Insurance Fund was living far beyond its means and was also not following conventional actuarial practice or providing the services in a sustainable manner. Reforming of the NHIF is critical to us achieving universal health coverage. Under the Cabinet Secretary, C.S. Kagwe, I believe we have made huge steps in terms of getting NHIF governance, first of all, back on track, putting at the centerpiece the role of sustainability of each of the programs, ensuring that the contributory mechanisms are transparent, funds are properly utilized, institutions, governance issues touching on resource mobilization and resource distribution are properly taken care of. So the people who, for example, mobilize resources for the NHIF are not the same people who will accredit hospitals and facilities that will provide services to the public. These are very critical interventions, and their use will become apparent in the days to come. In terms of completing the Managed Equipment Services Program, there's been a lot of noise about the MES program, but a lot of this noise is primarily hinged on who gets to procure. And in public services remain fairly contentious issues because everybody wants to be the procuring entity. The bottom line is Managed Equipment Services has had a huge transformation in our country. Over 90 hospitals in 47 counties now have diagnostic equipment for X-rays, mammography, cancer screening equipment, laboratory kit. And what has been delaying the coming into service of some of this equipment is delays by county governments, simple things, connecting water to dialysis machines in various hospitals, completing rooms for X-ray machinery, connecting electricity, connecting ICT equipment like fiber to allow for connectivity back to Kenyatta National Hospital for these hospitals. These are delays which are within our control, and with the goodwill of the devolved governments, we should be able to resolve these for the benefit of the citizens going forward. In terms of manufacturing, manufacturing perhaps is one of those elements that can chug along without too much exchequer intervention, save for one or two areas. But in terms of what the government is continuing its focus on is where we want to complete special economic zones, excuse the typo over there. So Naivasha is well on track in terms of a dry port and planning for the Naivasha Special Economic Zone. Dongo Kundu down in Mombasa with the partnership of the Japanese government is also well on track. We are at acquisition stage in terms of just resettlement of project affected persons. We are looking to bring to start marketing these economic zones probably in the tail end of 2021, and bringing in and taking advantage of the industrial transfer from Asia into Africa, and really bring those jobs and domesticate them in Kenya. Our agenda on logistics transformation continues with the Kenya National Logistics Network that has been put into place. We want to improve the flow of goods from port of entries right through on all the corridors. Lamu Port, part of Lamu Port is now done. The first berth of Lamu Port is now done. This can come into immediate use for purposes of transshipment. So big shippers coming out of Salala and Fujairah and other parts of the world are able to break down their super tankers in Lamu and then distribute down to Mombasa, Tanga, Dar es Salaam, Bagamoyo, down to Mtunzini, and really get this cargo, broken down cargo, cheaper, and using Lamu as a port of transshipment. While we work on the completion of the Lamu Special Economic Zone and also the backhaul of road infrastructure from Lamu all the way into Isiolo. These are probably initiatives that will not be completed within this medium-term plan, but sufficient work is done so as to ensure that they'll be completed by any subsequent planning administrations. Continued focus on the ease of doing business reforms. Many of you within this forum have interacted with the committee chaired by Honorable Aden Mohammed, Cabinet Secretary for East African Affairs, that has been dealing primarily with removing bottlenecks, red tape involved in business transactions. So far, Kenya is targeting to be within the 50 top destinations for doing business, but the president has set a target. He wants to be the top country in Africa in terms of ease of doing business by the end of his term. And that remains a key focus for delivery within that sector. Tax reforms, many of you have also been involved in tax reforms specifically to deal with import substitution. And COVID has become a big reality check for us. In terms of the 600 or so line items that we spend all our forex on in terms of imports, a big portion of those, probably more than 50% of those items, can be manufactured in Kenya or value addition done in Kenya. However, the environment for manufacturers needed to be improved to make our manufacturing sector competitive, so as to remove the need for importing those items. If we take this in combination with the COVID stimulus incentives on tax, the government is working very hard and in partnership with the private sector to remove some of these bottlenecks to allow for more import substitution. There is a new focus on energy pricing, and whereas this might sound counterintuitive in the light of recent developments on Kenya Power and Lighting, you will note that the president directed for the complete overhaul of the Kenya Power and Lighting board. And with that board, we expect over the next 2 or so years, a very deliberate review of Kenya Power and Lighting's agreements in terms of power purchase agreements, retirement of fossil fuel power purchase agreements, which were, thermal energy agreements, which were very expensive, relooking at some of the feed-in tariffs that have affected the overall price of power in the country. We aim to make sure that all the feed-in tariffs are sub $12 cents. And more importantly, to deal with the inefficiencies in KPLC that result in losses, probably about 30%, probably between 27 and 30% of losses occurring from distribution inefficiencies. And these costs, unfortunately, passed on to consumers and onto our manufacturing sector. So this focus does not require money, it just requires a resilience for us to turn the status quo on its head and to make sure that KPLC as a utility provider is providing power at the most affordable cost really to keep our economy churning. Leading the Buy Kenya initiative as government of Kenya, a couple of weeks ago, the government published a blue book, which is basically the list of all items that procuring entities in the public service must procure in Kenya as a first resort. And we hope that this will help to spur local businesses, particularly SMEs, and also help to shift the mindset. John, I was asked to give you a very specific message about dress code. I think your bankers are tired of wearing suits and ties. You can join us in our Friday wear. Some of the things we put on, like these Friday shirts. Rivertex, we can give you the contacts so that they come and do measurements for you, and you can lead the charge on your Friday dress down to make sure that your employees support Kenyan SMEs and primarily a lot of your clients who like fashion. So throw away your tie.
Very well taken. Thank you.
In terms of manufacturing, also just focusing on market access initiatives, both at the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, in which Kenya was the first country to sign, ratify, and return to Addis. We are waiting anxiously to take advantage of this. At the same time, looking at our national interests and our national imperatives, we are negotiating free trade agreements with what we believe are essential markets, the United States being one of them, the United Kingdom being one that we've just concluded, and there are others in the pipeline that we are looking at. The primary intention of this is to really provide our manufacturers, our farmers, with skills transfer opportunities, market opportunities, and basically improve our trading, our balance of trade with some of those jurisdictions. As I conclude, there are a number of key enablers that are mission critical, that are not necessarily cash heavy, but are very essential for us to continue delivering on the Big Four agenda. Number one is finalization of the Huduma number program. I cannot underscore how critical it is for us to have a database that has a single source of truth, that is verifiable, that can be then put into use both by public service in terms of understanding the individual, but also by the private sector. Today, Kenya being the leader in financial, financial inclusivity and innovation in terms of financial technology and fintech, we must have a database like Huduma that the banks or financial institutions can query without any fear of quality of that information. We think that will help to improve access to financial services for the bulk of our citizens. It will help to increase access to basic government services. It will help us also understand and manage commitments to the individual. So whereas we are 47 million Kenyans, we are also 47 million individuals that require customized service from the government of Kenya, from the time you get born and issued with your birth certificate till the time you die and are given your death certificate. All those services need to be properly chronicled and provided really for this generation and for future generations. Continued automation of government services, largely underpinned by getting the single source of truth correct. You will note that Cabinet Secretary for ICT, Joe Musheru, has been working night and day to improve government IT services, to move government away from largely analog solutions. So writing letters, which we are very good at, to really now responding in real time. The expansion of eCitizen, many of you don't realize that eCitizen has only been around from 2014. It has been a brainchild of this administration, and it has transformed some of the things that we took for granted. The number of hours that people used to spend at Times Towers trying to renew driving licenses, the lack of transparency in getting renewals on various permits, your returns on your company registration and all those things, which are now effectively done with very little human interaction on eCitizen. Now expanding that and making it more sophisticated and making it more accessible to the majority of our population remains a key priority. Completion of ongoing key infrastructure gap projects. A lot has been said about infrastructure, but the president remains very single-minded that he will play his part in delivering, making a huge impact on the infrastructure gaps in the country. So case in point is some of our big shifts to complete the road networks, completion of the Lamu port, revitalization of Port Kisumu, the new dry port in Naivasha, rehabilitation of the meter gauge railway, the first of its kind being done all the way to Nanyuki, and looking at now the lines going to Nyahururu, looking at the lines going to Kisumu, and just trying to make sure that we provide infrastructure options for the business community, for travelers and for traders, just to make sure that they have affordable alternatives to do business and to move around in the most effective manner. Dealing with the big perennial problem of Nairobi's traffic and the image that Nairobi projects, the Nairobi Expressway, which is an off-balance sheet project, which we expect to complete again in early 2022, will completely transform traffic management within the city. And when you look at the expressway in conjunction with the completion of the ring roads around Nairobi, the southern bypass, the northern bypass, the western bypass, you will now be able to do a complete 360 around the city and decongest some of the inner roads and provide opportunities for traffic that's not Nairobi bound to circumvent the city and start relieving pressure on the city. This is alongside the bus rapid transit and commuter rail. We now have a completely refurbished commuter rail system, which you will be seeing coming into operation in coming weeks. And we hope that will also relieve traffic on the roads and provide alternatives to commuters. In terms of ongoing governance and political reforms, the government remains extremely committed, because these are key enablers of the Big Four, supporting the judiciary expansion and guaranteeing funds for the expansion of courts and access to justice across the country is an essential pillar, because access to justice is a prerequisite for good business and enforcement of business decisions. Political reforms. I don't need to tell anyone in this room this cycle that has been happening every time we have elections. You have a lack of confidence 1 year going into the election. You have a struggle to get out of that lull 1 or 2 years after the elections. And the more electioneering we have and election fever, it completely undermines forecasting of decisions, predictability of government policy, and just confidence and allowing people to make big bets in our economy. The president is committed to reforming this environment and providing a situation where political contestation does not become a major setback to economic progress. Trying to provide a business as usual environment during elections is very critical, and during our electoral processes, such that business can continue doing business and politicians can continue doing politics without cross-contamination that has really hurt our economy. And some of these unsaid things underlie his commitment to the Building Bridges initiative, which, whereas has a lot of political undertones, remains a very basic and fundamental tool for us to get some stability in our economy and some predictability going forward. It goes without saying that continued prudent fiscal management remains a priority of the national government. I think the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury has signaled time and time again that he's not going to make any shocking or earth-shattering decisions that could put the economy at risk. He's he's handled the economy with kid gloves. We've made sure that we are part of all the discourses happening at the Africa continental level with the G20 and the Paris Club as far as public debt restructuring is concerned. In the COVID situation, because it is no secret that the COVID will affect in large part the debt portfolio and the government's ability to continue managing its development agenda and servicing its external and domestic debt commitments. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention and I close. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Nzioka, for those comments. Now I'll turn it over to Rosalind, who will guide us to the next steps.
All right, so thank you, John, and thank you to our keynote speaker. Thank you for that very insightful, eye-opening presentation. Now we are going to turn our attention to a panel discussion, which will be led by our Chief Economist, Raphael. And may I ask all the ladies and gentlemen on this forum today to please continue to send your questions, your queries through the Q&A tab. We are going to be responding to them, so I do welcome you. So at this juncture, allow me to hand over to Raphael, who will invite the panelists and moderate the session.
Thank you very much, Rosalind, and thank you, Mr. Waita, for that highly detailed update of the policy execution. I wasn't aware that it was going to dovetail quite strictly with what our thoughts are with regards to just the macroeconomic developments now and going into the future. Anybody who listens to you keenly obviously can see that there's a lot of work that has gone into designing both the country's initial response to COVID-19, but also putting it on a more long-term and sustained basis for economic growth, including political reforms, as you did outline. And sometimes I know Kenyans, we get tired of the politics of the day and we think it's untidy, but the reality is we cannot dissociate it from the broader political economic questions. And indeed, it's the sine qua non of development, as it were. Now we'll have a very quick review with our panelists. We are very honored to have all of them here. And they've been introduced previously by Rosalind. So in the interest of time, I'll go straight into the discussion of the day, and I'll take our update as launched. The report will be available to all of you on our website. It gives indeed our thoughts regarding the economic recovery and ensuing path. So I'll welcome first Mr. Mushai Kanyiha to just give his a reaction to our thoughts regarding economic development, but also give some brief remarks about where we are at 7 months into the COVID economy, as we call it, and perhaps also give us an update on manufacturing broadly. Mr. Kanyiha, thank you. Coming.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you to NCBA Bank for hosting this forum, all the attendees and my fellow panelists. I'll be brief. I think a lot has been said by Raphael and what Mr. Waita was able to show us around the economy and the things that are going on. So I'll try and focus just to some of the manufacturing things and maybe some of the things that have not been said or might need to be emphasized a little bit more. First to say, obviously, it was a big shock at the beginning of the whole COVID pandemic in March and April, and we did see quite a bit of shrinkage in the marketplace, especially on the demand side. So in fact, a lot of the manufacturing stories around demand, because there was some shrinkage in demand and depended on sectors, because obviously some sectors, like famously globally, the toilet paper sector grew significantly in that first period. We had a fascination with toilet paper for some reason, but also foodstuffs and other things where everybody was busy. There was quite a lot coming out of the supermarkets, but it was followed by a bit of a lull going up till July, when the economies, we reduced the restrictions a bit on the economy, And that has enabled us to see some demand go up. I think that was also evidenced in the Stanbic Bank PMI. However, we also do our own sort of demand forecasting, just checking where our members are and what their feelings are. And in the third quarter, most of our members, more than 50% of our members, recorded reduced orders in terms of what they were able to produce for the market based compared to the prior year. And that follows very closely to what you are saying, Raphael, that there is a reduction in demand. And I think that's where the challenge is going to be from a manufacturing perspective. Where do we get the demand that is going to be, that we would be servicing in our manufacturing? Having said that, I think it is very sector specific, and that was also picked up. People in around food, people around agriculture, and also interestingly around construction have continued to do well, relatively well. There's still a lot of demand or sufficient demand out there that will need to be met, and manufacturers are able to meet that. I'll just again reiterate, and I think it was mentioned by Mr. Whiter and John earlier in his speech, is that there was some resilience shown also in the manufacturing sector, and in fact the tie-up with logistics, and no little thanks to the coordination with government, the COVID response command center and other ministries, so that we were able to keep things moving, even production moving. And thankfully, we were also worried about import markets, things coming from, we are very reliant on India, China, Egypt, both for finished goods, but also, say, for manufacturers, a lot of raw materials and inputs would be coming from those markets. And they were still able to flow. Some disturbance, some delays and so on, but largely still able to flow. So we, at CAM, we've been talking about keep Kenya moving. So we've been moving and been able to supply things, although we are seeing it at a lower level. So it is slowing down now. And I also wanted to add that the interventions did help, government interventions did help. And specifically, I think the payments, because liquidity and cash flows, I'm sure like the banks were also worried about because of the liabilities we have with them, that the VAT refunds, the payment of some of the pending bills, that was very helpful at the beginning of the pandemic, keeping things going. Looking forward, just to say, again, like everybody has said, it's been emphasized, it's still very unclear. And I want to reiterate what the group MD said. It's going to be about good policy, because we've got to be adjustable to policy about what we're going to be, the reactions we're going to be taking. Obviously, what the central bank did and how most banks have been very helpful to their customers, especially that's the feedback we're getting from our manufacturing sector. People have been able to restructure their facilities to be able to match their current cash flows and issues. So that has been useful. And we hope that will be continuing into the next year. I think it will be needed into the next year. Because I think one of the worries is that, yes, in fact, when we started off in March, the thing people had in mind is that, look, we just need to hold, we jikaza a bit for 6 months, 3 months, this thing will be over. We'll be out of this. But now we are going on 6, 7, 8, and we can see 9 months, and some people will not be able to hold anymore. So I think the fear is that we are now going to start seeing more closures or more people unable to survive because of liquidity issues or whatever other market issues. And we need policy that is going to help them survive or keep them alive longer, because of, I think, what I hear the economists call scarring. We don't want people closing earlier than they would necessarily have had to, because we were not able to support them. So from where we came from, the other opportunity we see, just to highlight, is that COVID is giving people, the lull gives us time to rethink the future of our country, to rethink the structures and the economy. Because right now, maybe there is no demand to supply, but we can start thinking about how we structure ourselves. And a lot of businesses are going through that whole process. Unfortunately, for some of them, it does mean it has an impact on employment, because what happens is you suddenly realize, oh, I was able to produce with 25% less people. Maybe I will keep this going. That's good for efficiency, productivity, but obviously for the national picture and employment, that could be a challenge. Then where we are a bit more worried is about some of the fiscal measures being taken, and we are engaging with government around those. Some of the taxes, although we did get some very good reprieve in April with the tax amendments bill, the Finance Act came back with a vengeance, and some of the measures in there are going to be detrimental, I think, for what we are trying to say that we need to survive going forward. Specifically, we are worried about the minimum alternative tax, because that is going to put pressure on people's cash flows who are already under pressure, because they're going to have to pay taxes even when they're not making any profitability. And it's based on your prior year's revenues, which may have started off very well, but you now have issues. So that is a worry. And then, of course, there was investment deduction, which was the industrial, what do they call it? Yeah, the investment deduction that you're able to enjoy, which was adjusted a little bit. But I think it was in terms of timing and the messaging. This is a time for people to invest in infrastructure, because as they prepare for what is coming in the future, like Mr. White said, we are expecting possibly some supply chains will be moving from the Far East into Africa. So this is a time to encourage investment, not to discourage it. So we do need some of those things looked at, and some of the things we continue engaging with. So, and manufacturing, again, like we've been saying, we've not been very competitive. The UNIDO competitive index, industrial performance index, has been placing us at around 115 globally. And we need to raise that number. So it's a number we want to focus with a lot on with government and say, how can we increase this number? And there are different policy levers that we can work on, including the Buy Kenya, Build Kenya, opening markets. I was happy to hear that we need to open markets, because that's what we need, where we can take our goods in the coming days. So I just want to be brief, and I'm sure we'll have more questions as we go along. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mushai. I think it's pretty obvious that, as you point out, there's probably some better news on the agro side, and maybe it's a good time to segue to Mr. Hosea to also just give us his brief remarks and developments from the agro side. Hosea?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this important meeting, Rafael. I am unable to put on my video because of my little bandwidth, but I hope you'll bear with me on this.
That's okay, thank you.
Having listened to the previous speakers, I mean, it's obvious that COVID-19 pandemic is here to stay with us. We just need to find a way of adjusting, which we're already doing. Speaking specifically on the agro side, and I'd just like to say that two things. One, on the domestic side, I mean, we've seen a couple of challenges that came with the pandemic, especially the closure of certain markets, which means that Kenyans at some places within the Republic were not able to access the food items that they needed. And the containment measures, which were obviously good, meant that, of course, there was no real movement of persons between counties to be able to access the food items. Having said that, specifically on horticulture, which is what I do every day, as you're aware, we are a sector that was probably most hit in terms of the pandemic. Of course, tourism and others were even much hit, but in terms of our businesses, at least we lost in the first half of the year for certain items, especially our flowers. The auction in Netherlands collapsed in March, but it's now back again. But again, because of the restrictions and lockdowns that are happening within our major market, which is Europe and the UK, we are down by another 20%. But we look forward to a better trading year, maybe as we get used, if I may use that terminology, as we get used to the pandemic, as we become more resilient, we foresee improvement of between 10 to 12% in the coming year. Currently, we have certain, challenges, and we are happy that government takes note of the challenges that befall the horticulture industry, specifically air freight. We have had discussions with the national carrier, and we are happy that they were gracious enough to turn some of their vessels to carry our fresh produce. But we continue to encourage more investment in cargo so that we can reduce our freight charges, which in the end means that we are able to deliver produce to the market at competitive prices. There are certain other things that we look forward to developing together with government and private sector that will ensure that we move forward to expand our access to international markets. Some of these simple things like having a hot water treatment for our mangoes. For those of you who may be aware, we don't export any mangoes to Europe at the moment. We lose about 800,000 metric tons of mangoes due to a fruit fly. So we need to have a hot water treatment here to be able to export. Australia needs us to fumigate our flowers at the port of exit. We don't have a fumigation facility at the moment that can be able to do that. And I don't know whether any of you has ever thought that trucks carrying fresh produce, which are about 4,000 daily on the road, have to queue behind trucks carrying construction materials, sand, cement, water, stones, at way bridges to up to 4 hours for them to be able to move to the airport at the port of Mombasa. We continue engaging with government. We have written to Kenha to be able to see how that can be facilitated. The whole idea is we need to make our trade more competitive. And I'm happy I heard from Nzioka Waita that the government is really developing infrastructure in terms of ports and airports. I just want to encourage that as we do this, let's remember that every airport in Kenya needs a cold storage system so that like recently, we visited the Mombasa International Airport. You'll be shocked that there is no cold storage system. So we move our seafood from Mombasa to various places in the world. We want to continue moving our fresh produce out of an airport like Mombasa International Airport. The runway is long enough. Any long-haul flight can land there, but there is no cold storage. So we continue to work closely and encourage everybody to work together so that we can be able to leverage on what we have to improve this sector. Thank you. I submit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Machuki. I think it's pretty obvious that both in your remarks and Mr. Mushai's, there's some green shoots for in the next year, and that's indeed very encouraging. Maybe it's about time we get, if there is a contrasting view from a policy watcher who's done this for many years. So Kwame, if you can give your remarks before we move to Mr. Wakashia.
Okay, thanks, Raphael, and thanks for the invitation once again. So I'll just make 4 points quickly. I think the first is the brief that you provided, confirmed something that's really, really interesting about Kenya's economy, which is to suggest that the services sector, in the depth of what Kenyans call a lockdown, but when the restrictions were the most stringent, agriculture provided most of the momentum for growth. Of course, many sectors, and specifically finance and all those, responded through providing digital means for their services that they need to. But the fact is that agriculture, for a good reason, that it's actually distributed in the field, agricultural activity, as is practiced in Kenya, is not subject to that kind of cross-contamination that everybody anticipated. So in a way, I think having that kind of sector, which of course whose productivity challenges I think Mr. Waita mentioned and which need to be raised, still it helps. So one of the things that it tells you is that for good or bad, I think it emphasizes, as you've mentioned, I think in the brief, or not rather in the presentation, if you did not mention it specifically, is that diversification challenge. Diversification is actually a strength when you face a shock of this kind. So that's something to be recognized. The second point is the output gap. I think that as everybody else, of course, if you look at the US and all other economies, I mean, economists ask, are we going to have is it a K-shaped recovery? Is it an L-shaped recovery? Is it a U-shaped recovery? And I don't think you made a call, but one of the things that is clear is that, yes, it'll take quite a while. I think you did. You said that it'll take quite a while before the growth path that Kenya was in at the beginning of the year and the anticipation of 6% growth would resume, suggesting to me that all other factors constant, we'll have a U-shaped recovery, I think, which is the best that could be done in the circumstances. So let's just hope that on the fiscal side, government keeps its discipline, the promises, and the policy intent, basically, so you send the right signals to the private sector so people don't know they're not alone, there'll not be a harsh pullback. Still, we must contend with the fact that I think the range of policy tools that were available to government of Kenya in the time that a crisis was faced tells us about why good economic policy management is always necessary. So that obviously, if you have to deal with the kind of shock that we have to, government had some space. This year, government didn't have much space. And I think you could see that it was aggravated by, well, a political contest, if you think about it, between the senators, in the Senate, about sending money back to the counties. Because my thinking is that the kind of role that counties in Kenya play, I think pushing money to counties, or rather, the equitable share to counties was substantially delayed. And in my view, that went right into, or rather coincided with the depth of the restrictions, but at the same time also aggravated the possible recovery once the president had made the decision in July to continue to relax it. So on the other side, again, I think there's some things that happened, but the other things, so that was a political contest. I think it suggests that it should have been resolved much, much earlier. But on the whole, what it tells us is that institutions, or rather the institutions in government, when they have to make decisions, it's clear for them, it's important for them to make those decisions in a prompt way that does not necessarily aggravate or contribute to further damage. The one point that I didn't find as you mentioned is, and perhaps you did, but I was listening keenly, is a couple of days back, somebody from Botswana, basically just somebody who studies currencies in Africa, called me and asked me that they read a South African newspaper reporting that Kenya has a parallel market in foreign currency now. And I was not aware of anything to do with that. So I'm just wondering how Kenya's currency will, and what role it will play over the next 2 years as we expect a full recovery to take place. But that was a curious one, because my personal view has been that the Kenya shilling has appeared to be far too strong. Most of you seem to think that all other factors, most people in the financial sector seem to think that all other factors considered, it's in a reasonable space. But I think that it might not necessarily be attributed to the pressures of COVID and the need for a quick recovery. But Kenya's currency is going to face more pressure. How that works out for exports, I'm not too sure. But on the whole, I think it suggests that the currency side is one of the things that will need to be more clear about, or rather to watch more keenly. So yes, talking about a policy watcher, it actually called me to attention that, well, what are you missing? I think we are watching the output gap and everything else, but I didn't know how the currency and any pressures that it might have would probably work with the existing ones. And the final one is that I agree with you and everybody else who says that, look, all factors considered, Kenya is looking up, and that's true. We might be, except for, as the president was concerned yesterday, we might be out of the worst, but of course we need to be very cautious between now and the end of the year regarding private behavior and obviously the possibility of greater contamination or other contagion. But what I think is a significant part of economic recovery is what we call now at the IEA the school economy. Considering that some 16 million kids are out of school and the forward and backward loops that the school economy gives to the rest of the economy in terms of basically some demand for some services that can only be consumed within schools, that can only be used in schools, and employment. Obviously, as you all know, most schools, when they closed, got rid of some lower level, in some cases, teachers as well. So understanding that there should be no rush because of obviously the great possibility of harm to people's health when schools reopen. I think the when schools reopen in January, and especially with the safety measures in place, it is possible that there'll be greater boost to many other sectors that are connected to the school economy through first order effects and second order effects. But otherwise, that stated, thanks for the analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kwame. So I think you point to an interesting contrast. I think the idea that the allocation of revenue between central government and the counties could have aggravated the COVID impact indeed cannot be gainsaid. The reality, though, is that overall, I think even previously the sort of locust invasion impact into Q1, which of course has contributed also to some of this slower growth in 2020. If you add those two, it's obvious that this is what gives us, for instance, the Q2 performance of a contraction of 5.7%, as we point out. On the currency, I think the reality is, and I did speak to this, we do have a very vastly improved balance of payment dynamic. Now, anybody can quibble with the character of that balance of payment dynamic in the sense that on the demand side, you have a vast reduction of traditional demand, out of just price level dynamics on the energy side, but also if you look at import performance, especially heavy facility type importations around SGR type expenditure that we've been used to in the recent past. Those have been reduced. So you find that really vastly improved balance of payment dynamic. I think that has supported stability in the currency for the most part. So what we can confirm is the management of the currency as indeed a price, and given its importance to inflation and inflation outlook, has been, frankly speaking, very impressive. Be that as it may, we have recorded pressure, and that's what we can confirm. There's been pressure on the currency also arising from just kind of repositioning, and I think in terms of rebalancing how Kenya faces the external world, which really is what the trade dynamics would speak to. And I think it's early days before we can reach a decision in terms of actual currency performance, but our forecast provide what they have given. That's what we can confirm. And then, of course, thanks also for your useful comments on the school economy and how that plays out. Now, in terms of just the monetary policy fiscal interplay, we are very honored to have Dr. Wagasha, who's, he's been at this for years. So as we said, countercyclical policy responses, some of which both Mr. Waita, Kwame, and even Mr. Kunya have spoken to, have been very supportive. But Dr. Wagasha, just as you give your remarks, could you give us some color on the potential play within the between monetary policy and fiscal policy in the days ahead, particularly as we seek to support the ensuing recovery which we project in 2021? Dr. Wagasha. I think you're on mute. Could you just unmute, please? You're on mute. Yes.
Are we okay?
Yes, now you're unmuted. Please go ahead. You are on mute.
Thank you for having me. This is one of the most interesting forums I've seen anywhere, really. And I find myself encouraged, hugely encouraged by the analysis that have gone before me. And especially by Mr. Nzioka Waita. I've had the privilege of working with him at the executive office, and by the chief economist of the NCBA, Raphael. I find myself in agreement with much of what has been said, with apologies to Mr. Gashara. Perhaps he needs to lend Rosalind to Mr. Waita. A great deal of work is going on. I don't think it's given the coverage that it needs and it merits. I also think that my friend Mushai needs to talk a bit more with Mr. Waita, because a lot of the frameworks that Mr. White went through, and which Rosalind, if lent to State House, can help with, a lot of the work going on, especially in the tour de force on manufacturing and domestication and reshoring or domesticating economic activity, is not in the intellectual domain of many people in this country. So I would like to basically then go back to some of the agreements of the analysis that I had, basically on 4 points. Number one, COVID has reversed about 10 years of an average of 5.85% GDP growth. A commendable achievement by President Uhuru Kenyatta and his administration was that over 10 years, we had over 5%, nearly 6% GDP growth, and COVID has reduced it. It has plunged now to, IMF is saying -1%, World Bank -1.5%. We're down back to the bottom. It's fallen by plunged by about 4%. Now, my biggest concern on this topic of the reversal of GDP growth, my biggest concern is that we did not re-equip the economy sufficiently during the 10 years of success of the administration. We did not create enough buffers for the economy to protect itself. We needed to have established buffers such as the PPP to be able to release some of the burden of financing growth from the public sector to the private sector. We needed to have done our PPP work solidly. We needed to have made use of some of our very strong ammunition, financial sector ammunition, in diaspora remittances. And I'm sure that Mr. White would attest to it, that we ran through ideas at State House, that we needed to channel our remittances in such a way that they would strengthen the financial sector, the commercial banks, and that they would strengthen the financing of many of the projects that we need to domesticate manufacturing, like Mr. Muchai is saying. We needed to have created a buffer called the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Many countries, when COVID came, were able to buffer themselves, like Nigeria, like Netherlands. Many of them, which formed their sovereign wealth funds earlier, were able to buffer themselves by releasing some of the stabilization funds from sovereign wealth funds to economic activity. So there are some of these things that we really needed to have done before. And another one, of course, is, as Raphael pointed out, it was was consolidation, fiscal consolidation, which we have not really been able to implement fiscal consolidation, and the consequence is that in financing some of our pressures, we've had to go to high yielding debt. Now, when COVID came, some of the countries, some of the major countries of the world have become Keynesians. The fiscal multiplier has become a major way of solving some of the problems of COVID. Not monetary policy. Monetary policy has not been very, very strong. There's been better coordination across countries on monetary policy. But fiscal policy has been the real dynamic the stimulus that helped Kenya or helped the US by trillions of dollars to survive during this period has been a stimulus to ensure that households are supported, sectors are supported, etc., etc. I'll talk on 2 or 3 more points. I have a document which I'm going to send to, I don't know whether we can share it on the screen. That document there. It's surprising that if you look at that graphic, it just reflects what Raphael pointed out about our GDP. Our 10 years of success are there. The last time we had a problem of this kind was in 2007, 2008, when the administration of that time was faced with the global financial crisis. And very, very expertly, the Kibaki administration was able to put in a stimulus. And Raphael reflects that in the same graphic, was able to put a stimulus that gave us a shape of recovery, which was a V shape. It's called a V shape. You dip into recession, but then you use expertise and fiscal and monetary tools to rise up quickly. And we rose to 8.4% at that time. The biggest problem we have at this steep end 2020 is that we are not sure whether we can achieve a V-shaped recovery or whether it will be a U-shaped recovery. A U-shaped recovery is slower to fill in the GDP gap that Kwame Owino talked about. It's slower to do that, but it gets the job done eventually. Or, thirdly, we are not sure whether we will have an L-shaped recovery. An L-shaped recovery means that you have a permanent loss in output. And I would like to converse with Raphael later about this, because I think we need much more expertise to government and to the private sector to ensure that perhaps in light of what Mr. Waita is saying about strengthening domestic manufacturing, focusing health, focusing certain elements of domestication of economic activity, whether we can reshape the negative 4% dip, reshape it into a V recovery. That is our major challenge. And not to take too much time, the question about that Owino raised about currency overvaluation, that is what he's talking about. It's not really unique to Kenya. Most currencies of the emerging markets have lost a great deal of value due to a very, very substantial flight to quality, flight of capital from emerging markets to quality in dollar and reserve currencies. We've lost, as you can see in that small, we've lost about just in about 9 months. We've lost about 10 shillings per dollar, to the dollar. We started at 100 in February. We are at 108.8 in the end of October. So this is not unique to Kenya, and perhaps in many senses, it is consistent with what Mushai is asking for. That if you, Mushai and Hosea are asking for, if you, even if your currency depreciates and it's still driven by market forces, it gives the domestic economy, gives exporters, gives agriculture better headroom for competing in world markets. So this recovery, if we achieve it, will be assisted by a currency that more or less tracks the market. The other point I would like to say is to express surprise with what Mr. Hosea said about the sectoral impacts of COVID. This chart here shows the impacts of COVID on the top 5 sectors of the economy. And Hosea is right on the dot, that the sector that lost the GDP share, the highest portion of the GDP share, was agriculture. And that is where, in many senses, we should have focused our fiscal space, our limited fiscal space, because about 75% of households and Kenyans rely on this sector, and it has lost negative 5.65%, as you can see. Other sectors that received the stimulus, and this is a question of whether actually, I'm just turning around in my mind, whether we really used the depth of expertise available in Kenya to craft our stimulus. A sector like agriculture hasn't got, wasn't seen on the platform when the ladies walked out, but the sectors like tourism, including animal conservancies, wildlife conservancies, received stimulus assistance. And you're talking about 75% of households in Kenya who lost the greatest part of GDP decline in Kenya, and we haven't heard about them. And of course, tourism, the tourists may be happy, the conservancies may be happy, but remember that we also gave tax breaks, personal income tax and corporate tax reductions from 30% to 25%. So the tourism sector, with this kind of with the kind of support that they received a double assistance, the stimulus and also a reduction in taxation. So my appeal, Chairman, Mr. Gashora, if you allow me, and the other participants, my appeal is that we intensify expertise and competencies in going forward to assist people like Mushai and Mr. Hosea to rebuild the economy and to assist maybe a conversation between us and State House, where I worked before, to ensure that some of the intense and very well thought out goals that we had from Mr. Waiter are implemented with expertise. Expertise. Nothing beats expertise. These days, you would not be getting anywhere, including communication and marketing, like Rosalind will attest. You wouldn't get anywhere without expertise. And it's not a question of picking people for jobs, etc. It's a question of the nation or of the country. So one more point, if you allow me, is to look at how banks, it's in the interests of banks to support whatever shape of economic recovery we end up with. The main assistance to commercial banks, working with the central bank where I worked before as chairman of the CBK, is really to move liquidity and to ensure that financing facilities are working smoothly and that we have exchange rate stability, that our exchange rate is stable and there's no disruption as Owino in his call from Botswana had. But so that is what we need. But in spite of that, the real interest for commercial banks to get in on this all hands on board activity is that they themselves, commercial banks, will be losing a great deal of traction if we do not join hands with others, like the sectors I spoke about, like the Mr. Whiter's ideas, like the ideas that Raphael put together on the in his presentation. The first thing is that unless we can quicken the shape of our recovery to a V or at least to a U curve, unless we can do that, banks are losing value on stock valuations to begin with. Banks will lose values in terms of loan portfolios. I'm sure you would tell me, and if you showed me the data, I'm sure that banks are having problems lending to people. You don't have enough confidence from a risk point of view to push your loan book. And which is even worse, banks need to get in on the act, because unless we get on board together, the non-performing loans portfolios will increase. And whether the central banks keeps publishing what they do and tracking them, they will increase. And which means that the banks, commercial banks, will have to provision for non-performing loans. Provisioning means that the operating income of shareholders in commercial banks will also decline. So your shareholders will take the end of the stick, because the profitability of banks will be affected by the provisioning for bad loans, etc. So we need to get all hands on board. Summarize quickly that Mr. Whiter's ideas need Rosalind's support, with apologies to Mr. Gashara. Mr. Whiter needs to talk to Mr. Muchai. We need much more expertise of Mr. Raphael's kind on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wagasha, for that rendition. Now we promised to get you out at 10. I sincerely apologize. We've overrun that. So I'm noticing a number of questions. We enjoy the back and forth, and indeed would have liked to have as much back and forth as possible with these distinguished panelists. We will keep the conversation going. Rosalind will assure you shortly that we will be back quickly, but I think it would be remiss on my part to not honor our promise to keep within the schedules that you've allotted for us. So economic conversation is endless. Maybe it's only reminiscent of what's going on in the US right now. There's lots of conversation. So I'd add that with that, allow me to end there and hand over back to Rosalind to carry on with the session.
Thank you, Raphael, and thank you so much to all the panelists for that very engaging conversation. It's a shame that we've run out of time, but as Raphael has said, we will be back in February 2021 to continue this conversation. At this point, I just want to let you all know that we've had thousands of people viewing this conversation together with us. This will be made available on our social media handles, so stay tuned. But for now, I would like to hand over to our Group Director, John Okulo, responsible for corporate banking, to give the vote of thanks and to close this meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. And to all our panelists and guests, the participants, we really appreciate your time. And we appreciate you joining us today. I would like to give a vote of thanks to our chief guest, Mr. Zioka Waita, who has very clearly articulated the government's program and agenda. And I believe that this provides business and individuals with confidence that despite this tragic health situation that we're going through, there is focus and there is continuous direction to grow our economy. And even as we grow our economy, there are certain pillars that the government has put in place to protect the most vulnerable in our society. So thank you very much, Mr. Waita, for that. I would also like to thank our panelists, Mr. Kunyiha, Dr. Wagasha, Mr. Kwame Owino, Mr. Jose, for also giving us the views from your respective sectors that just brought everything together. I think from my perspective, I recall in April when we had this discussion, there was extreme uncertainty and a lot of panic that was going on. We didn't know which direction this health crisis will lead to. But through the past few months, we have accepted that it is a tragic situation, but with the right protocols in place, it is a health crisis that can be managed. And if we do manage the health aspects successfully, then it makes it much easier for the economy to rebound. Now, there's always going to be a lot of uncertainty, as our group MD mentioned. But one thing we also need to be thankful for is that as much as GDP has dropped, we are still producing as a country, we are still producing goods and services and doing it in different ways. When I looked at the guest lists and the participants who had accepted to join us this morning, one thing that I was very happy to see was the number of participants from outside of Nairobi, especially from Mombasa. I recall in 2019, when together with Dr. Wagasha and our economics team, we had to go down to Mombasa to have a similar presentation. But now with the use of ICT, we can get all our customers to join us at this forum. So yes, there are certain sectors that are working out through this. For our customers who are borrowing, one thing that I'd really like to emphasize is in times of uncertainty like this, liquidity is king. We've spoken about the macroeconomic situation and the government's fiscal position, but at the individual micro level, the ability to preserve liquidity is extremely important. The moratoria that were granted by most banks for about 3 to 6 months, it was based on the assumption that this crisis will end within a short period and we'll go back to normal. I think we've all accepted that this crisis is with us for a while, and even once the health issue has been dealt with, business will not go back to normal. Businesses are adjusting, and the most important one has to do is to preserve liquidity and to find ways of operating efficiently in this new normal. And therefore, we're encouraging our customers to look at their capital structures, the level of debt and the level of equity, and to see how best they can manage their debt within a position where demand has reduced and the future is uncertain. That said, we'd also like to emphasize the importance of remaining competitive. So we're encouraging our customers to not stop investing in efficiencies. And our relationship management team are very willing to engage with customers on that aspect. We are committed to long-term partnerships, and we are certainly open to discuss any challenges that you may be having as we go forward. Last but not least, I must thank our Group MD for making this session possible, and our economics team led by Raphael Agum for all the hard work that they put in research, and of course Rosalind Gishuru and her team for ensuring that this conference has been the success that it has. So with those few words, I would like to wish you all a very pleasant day, and I hand back to Rosalind.
The meeting is officially over, so have a good day, and thank you very much once again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.